Okay, great. So we are now recording. And again, thank you so much everybody for joining. I'm gonna go ahead and also just mute everybody real quick, just so that we don't have any background noise and everyone can hear the content. But you will be able to unmute yourself at any time. So real quick introductions. We'll go ahead and get started. Omar and Jason, if you all could kick us off. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Omar Figueroa. Can you hear me? Yeah. And I've been a lawyer in Sonoma County for 10 years now. I've been a lawyer overall for 22 years, focusing on freedom defense. And it's an honor to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Sadowski. I've been living in Sonoma County for about 7 years now. I have my PhD in ecology, where I studied animal behavior, and I recently became a data scientist studying human behavior. And I've been part of the ACLU Sonoma County law enforcement and surveillance team, along with Omar, where we've been looking through the status of law enforcement surveillance technology here in Sonoma County. We're excited to share our results with you.
And hi, everybody. Raquel Ortega. I go by they, them, and she, her pronouns. And I'm a community organizer with the ACLU, working with our immigrant rights and our tech and civil liberties team. So again, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to talk with you. And yeah, if you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself in the chat. We won't have time for everybody to introduce yourselves, but I would love to see where people are coming from. So quick agenda, welcome and intros. We've already checked that off the list. We're moving along. We're next gonna talk about the big picture problems with surveillance, followed by a deep dive into what we know about what's happening in Sonoma County. Then we'll look into one of the solutions that we're proposing for cities in the county, and that is a surveillance technology ordinance. We'll talk a little bit about what ordinances are and how to pass one, followed by what you can do to get involved. So with that, let's jump into what is the problem with tech and surveillance. So surveillance in the United States is out of control. We're seeing a rapid expansion of data collection and storage, tracking and mining at unprecedented levels. And unless we fight back, this country is at risk of turning into a full-fledged surveillance society. But how did we get here? This is a question we get a lot. Technology is something that is, technological advances are something that are normal oftentimes, right? We see new and safer uniforms, new and safer medical vaccines, right? Cars, basic walkie-talkies, things that allow us to communicate better and make our lives easier. But unfortunately, now we're also seeing things that are being used against us, right? Drones, automated license plate readers, facial recognition software, and social media monitoring. And this really was ramped up after 9/11. After 9/11, surveillance on the public has exploded under the guise of the war on terror, the war on terrorism. The Department of Homeland Security has invested millions of dollars in terrorism prevention and law enforcement initiatives, including in the Bay Area. So they have these federal grants, which then provide local law enforcement with funding. And the result has been that local law enforcement has been able to buy high-grade military and surveillance equipment at no cost to them, or at little cost to them. And what's worse is that much of the technology is acquired with no public input, no policies, and no accountability. So there's a really large cost to all of us when this happens. We like to think that technology is neutral, But the truth is that technology reflects the biases of its creators. In the case of facial recognition, which is repeatedly proven to be biased against Black and brown people, the algorithms will reproduce and magnify the racism in our current legal system. The more we allow unrestricted surveillance into our communities, the more it erodes our civil rights and the things that actually matter to us. So there's cost to our civil liberties, right? Oftentimes these tools don't even address the real problems we're trying to solve. When police are poorly trained or the technology has not been clearly thought through, cities are the ones who face lawsuits because they violate people's rights or harm them. And these tools also erode the trust between police and communities, as well as the trust within our cities. So it's really important that we have community input and that there's proper mechanisms and protocols in place to keep an eye on this. I want to talk about a few different pieces of technology. There's a lot of different types, but these are some that are especially dangerous and becoming more popular over time. So there's automated license plate readers, which capture photos of license plates in surrounding areas. So the images are not just of the license plate themselves, but also people who are in the car. As these cameras track license plates, police can quickly paint a picture of where you're going, who you associate with, and how you spend your day. ACLU really first discovered how this was being used and how it was being used improperly. After 9/11, when we discovered they were being placed in parking lots of mosques to track Muslim residents going and coming. And again, it's any car. So everybody is treated as a suspect. There's also drones. Drones are very small. They can be equipped with thermal imaging, heat mapping to determine where people are based on body temperature, cameras, and microphones. And as I mentioned before, facial recognition. This relies on a database of faces. So oftentimes there'll be a mugshot database, but also we've been hearing about with Clearview AI using social media as a database. So if the way that this can be used is, let's say a video is captured at a protest. Police can then run that video through the software to figure out who was actually at the protest. And all this is done without a warrant, oftentimes. So now I'm going to hand it off to Jason to talk a little bit more about how this tech works.
Yeah, thanks, Raquel. Yeah, I just want to spend a few minutes just talking a little bit more about, just a little bit about the nuts and bolts, trying to demystify this a little bit. And the thing I'm going to start with is just this idea of computer vision, which is used in both ALPRs, this automated license plate readers, as well as facial recognition. And what essentially happens is the computer is given an image, and then it analyzes that image for like specific colors and arrangement of pixels, right? And with ALPRs, it's pretty simple for the license plate portion, because basically the computer is just looking for like letters and numbers, and then it converts that into just the license plate, the whole readout. But when it comes to facial recognition, it's a little bit more complicated. And so that's what we have here. We have my face, which is given to the computer here. And so what has to happen is the computer has to figure out where the face is in the image. And that's what this little box represents. And then it needs to convert that image of my face into something that it can use numbers for. So what we have here is little dots and measurements of like how far apart are my eyes, how far are my eyes from my forehead, etc. And then it strips away that image. We can go, and so all we are left with just with those numbers and just with that representation of that face. And so then the computer can then say like, okay, well, what is the closest face in its large database, which, as Raquel mentioned, could be a lot of different things, even just a social media collection of photos, things like that. And it figures out which of those numbers matches up most closely to it. Now, I'm glossing over a lot of the details, and some of these different algorithms work in different ways. However, it's all basically matching some sort of numeric values associated with your face to this big collection. And the problem occurs when these matches aren't necessarily accurate, right? So just to run through a couple scenarios about how police officers could use this in practice, right? You could be given, for example, maybe there was a break-in at like a convenience store, and they could look at the before and after surveillance footage and say, okay, who was in both of those footages? Which seems to be a relatively narrow use of surveillance. But things get more complicated when you start doing this kind of big dragnet surveillance aspects that Raquel mentioned, right? You could be given a mugshot of a suspect, for example, and then see if that mugshot matches anyone in this footage of a crime scene. Or you could have just the footage of a crime scene or a protest, and then just automatically run every face through that and run against known suspects, as well as things like social media databases as well. But if you advance one more, please. There was Raquel. There was an article, I guess one more than that. There was an article in the New York Times recently actually talking about how the bias, there's actual bias in the technology in itself, not just how that technology is applied, right? What happens is these matches are really accurate when it comes to white faces, but it's more likely to falsely match faces between African-American, multiple African-American faces, or multiple Asian faces. And so why this happens is that the people who develop the algorithm are typically only using white faces or some sort of racially biased group in the process. And so this could create a lot of false matches, which could then lead to false evidence and false imprisonment for a lot of over-policed people of color. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So what I have here are two types of surveillance technologies that Raquel didn't really go over because there's not a big push on them here in Sonoma County. However, I do want to mention them because they do exist and it's something to keep an eye for. And those are called predictive policing and fusion centers. Next slide. So predictive policing is an algorithm-based risk assessment tool, which is basically a fancy formula where they put in these inputs and say, how much of a risk is this person or this location, right? And this is developed typically using computer algorithms. And so the thing about computer algorithms and these formulas is that they're made by people, right? And people have biases, either conscious or unconscious, or they can have biases or just blind spots. And those blind spots can be sufficient to bias and create just racist outcomes. So for example, you could have a location-based algorithm that uses things like historical crime statistics, where and when a crime occurs. And if you use that tool in an over-policed neighborhood, then you're more likely to predict that crimes will occur there because police in the past have arrested more people, for example. Similarly, if you have a person-based algorithm for risk assessment based on things like a person's age, their gender, their criminal record, you can see how an over-policed demographic group would be more likely to have higher risk, even if they may not actually be at higher risk of committing crimes. And so this raises some interesting questions about like the Fourth Amendment, for example, saying like, is it sufficient evidence for a search if you just happen to be in a crime hotspot based off of these location tools? This kind of gets close to like the stop and frisk meth policies of New York about 10 years ago. Let's go to the next slide. And so fusion centers are a little different. They're not actually a surveillance tool per se. They're actually more like an intelligence gathering network. And basically what happened was after 9/11, the FBI and the law enforcement community realized that they needed a more regional approach to collect intelligence and prevent domestic terror attacks, right? And so fusion centers fill that role. What we have here is a picture of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. It's basically the fusion center that operates around here. And what happens is that all of the surveillance we've been discussing, things like ALPR data, social media posts, criminal records, that gets funneled into this big data warehouse at the fusion center. And so Then once all the information's within this centralized location, FBI analysts then can then mine through it and determine potential threats or potential planned attacks, which in the context of preventing domestic terror seems like a reasonable goal. The issue is that fusion centers are essentially have almost no oversight over them because they exist between federal governments and state governments. So no one really knows who has the authority to regulate them. There's a lot of unanswered questions about them. What makes it a little even worse if you are dealing with fusion centers is that essentially that evidence can become classified. And so you could have evidence against a client, for example, that could then be classified and be difficult to access, basically creating additional barriers to public scrutiny. And now, while we don't have a lot of evidence that fusion centers are being actively used in the Sonoma County community, there's at least some evidence that at least the sheriff's office uses it for some purposes, which I'll discuss later on. Next slide. Okay, so what do we know about surveillance technology here in Sonoma County? Let's go to the next slide. So to answer that question, what I did was I used a tool called the Atlas of Surveillance. It's a project that records, thanks, that records essentially all the known surveillance technology used at hundreds of different municipalities across the country, and focusing in on Sonoma County and the various Sonoma County police departments, as well as the Sheriff's Office and Sonoma State University. So using this atlas, I was able to find evidence for 5 different types of technology. We've already talked about ALPRs and fusion centers. And you'll see that pretty much every police department uses body-worn cameras, which is a typical camera that a police officer would wear when they're out doing on patrol. There's also camera registries, which is something that I didn't think about prior to doing this survey, which essentially is a list of a privately owned camera, where the owners of that camera are willing to pass that footage along to the police if requested. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. And then there's, of course, drones, the typical unmanned aerial vehicle that everyone thinks about when they think about drones, I guess. So what I did was, once I was able to survey and figure out which municipalities had which surveillance instruments, I then went in and tried to examine the different policies that the police departments had for these surveillance tools. Next slide. So here what we have is basically just a quick overview of the different surveillance technologies that are used by different police departments. So the first takeaway is that you can see body-worn cameras are pretty much present across all the different police departments, like I mentioned earlier. This seems like a reasonable use of surveillance. You want to have some sort of evidence that what the police officers are doing, right? But then what you also see is that ALPRs. Oh, didn't know that Hilbert got a drone. So ALPRs are present across a lot of different communities. One thing I forgot to correct on here is that the sheriff's office doesn't actually have an ALPR, but what we know that it does, this is in their policies, is that they access ALPR data through the fusion center, the NICRC fusion center that I mentioned earlier. So the use cases of ALPRs can range from things like parking enforcement to essentially canvassing the areas around a recent crime scene. There's also been evidence in the past that this ALPR data, if it's a car or vehicle registered to an undocumented immigrant, that can be passed along to ICE. I'm not saying that's happened in Sonoma County or not. I'm just saying that has been done in other communities. Like I said, we have some evidence of fusion centers by the sheriff's office, but it's possible that other police departments are using them as well. Next slide. Okay, so the main policy findings, right? So the first thing I'll do before we go into the details is that almost every police department in Sonoma County uses pre-written policy guidelines from a company called Lexipol. Essentially, they're a third-party company that writes out police guidelines that basically offshores their document writing. there's a couple exceptions to that. The first being that the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office tended to start with a lexical guideline, and then it would customize it for specific use cases. And then there's also, I found an additional document written by the Healdsburg Police Department that they created their own ALPR policies in addition to the ones written by Lexipol. And those ALPR policies were to basically ensure that the ALPR data wouldn't be used for that very specific undocumented community case that I mentioned earlier. So if you do find it interesting to read through all these policy documents, you'll see that the exact ordering or the exact verbiage of the policies may differ across the various police departments, but they're all generally saying the same thing. So starting with the most comprehensive policies were the body-worn cameras and drones, right? And these tended to have long, well-described use policies. And this is probably because there's a lot of public conversation and scrutiny around these types of surveillance equipment as well as how they're used, right? In addition to that, California state law has made it illegal to use facial recognitions or biometric scanning on body-worn camera footage specifically. Now, there's no such ban on facial recognition for drone footage. There might be some opening it in their policies. We're not really sure. Essentially, it says in the drone policies, it says that drones are allowed to use vision enhancement technology, which typically is like thermal imaging equipment. So who knows if they're doing some sort of facial recognition on that as well. I honestly could see it happening. Let's go to advance the slide. Thanks. So ALPRs, that's everything. You can stop there. So ALPRs had a lot less clear documentation and policy around it, right? And there's two major issues that I found. The first thing was what happens with the security breach, right? We live in a world where essentially we have to assume that if you're collecting data and you have some sort of data warehouse, for example, like a server for ALPRs, the license plate readers, that's going to be breached at some sort of time, and some sort of malicious actor is going to take that information. Well, there's actually no information on this that I could find, at least publicly available, in the police policies. So I looked through every policy, and all of them said that, and I quote here, it says, "For security or data breaches, see the records release and maintenance policy." And this policy is not available. Either it doesn't exist at the various municipalities I looked at, or you just can't find it on the internet. So that's, again, a major issue when you're thinking about the data collected, which is location data. And again, I'll talk about that more in a second. The second issue here is that all these policies also say that an ALPR can be used in conjunction with any routine patrol operation or criminal investigation. Reasonable suspicion or probable cause is not required before using an ALPR. What this means is that police officers can use ALPRs at any time, right? So if you consider some sort of license plate reader to be the equivalent of looking up someone's license plate information at a traffic stop, that doesn't seem too bad, right? But it's actually not this. It's actually very different, which is because we're collecting data, and there's a very big difference between just looking up someone's license plate and using an ALPR to collect license plate data. Because what's happening is the ALPR system is storing the license plate as well as other information, like where did it find this license plate? What time was it? What day was it? And that information is stored for a minimum of 1 year. If it becomes evidence, it then becomes stored for longer. In the meantime, we don't really know what police officers or police departments can do with this data. It could be shared with other police departments or municipalities. It could be passed into these fusion centers, for example. And so, again, when it comes to nonviolent protests, it could very easily track individual cars across various protests and other locations using an ALPR system. Let's go to the last advanced one more. So what I find really concerning is when a policy doesn't exist at all. And that's what I found the case for camera registries and fusion centers, right? So camera registries, like I mentioned earlier, says that you're gonna make this list of who has who has a privately owned camera, right? But there's no real policy guideline that states, okay, when can we access those cameras, under what sort of situations? Is it just any situation? How do the police officers access that information? That's all basically unknown to us as the public. And then at the Fusion Center level, again, there's no real policy about when and how police departments can share information and use information from Fusion Centers. I think it's hard to expect police departments to conduct responsible surveillance if we don't even have written rules shared with the public. Next slide. So this is where you all come in. We really like to know if you have any kinds of experiences with police surveillance. A lot of these policies are ambiguous, and it's really unclear to see how or how often these technologies are being used. So we'd love to get your input. Feel free to, I guess, take yourself off mute or just share your stories in the chat. We'll take a few minutes of that if anyone has any interesting stories they'd like to share here.
For folks who are newer to Zoom, you should be able to see a toolbar. Oftentimes it's at the bottom of your screen. And in the very left-hand corner, you'll see a microphone, and you can click on that to unmute yourself. Has anybody seen any cameras, whether in your neighborhood or out downtown? We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, hi, this is Paul. I've just curious, a couple years ago, I was doing a vigil for Black Lives Matter in Sebastopol and just happened to be taking a break, sitting in front of the Whole Foods on a bench. A police car came by. The police officer looked directly at me, and I'm curious, were he to use his body camera to take a picture of me, how would that fall in terms of the issues of surveillance? It wasn't a license plate reader, it was just an officer coming by, but clearly he was looking directly at me because I was holding a Black Lives Matter sign. So I'm curious how that falls into all this.
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. Thank you so much. I will say the ACLU worked with community partners and privacy advocates to pass a law. I can't remember now if we actually passed it last year or the year before because time it doesn't feel real anymore, but we did pass a law. What is current law at this moment is in the across the state, no law enforcement is allowed to use facial recognition with body-worn cameras. AB 1215 was the name of the bill that we worked on around that, but yeah, that is definitely something that was a big concern for us. Having said that, if there were some type of other camera nearby, unfortunately, you would not have, and you get picked up in that. They could potentially have your face in that or use facial recognition with that.
So I'm assuming or checking here an assumption of the citizens that have their cameras registered. Does that include merchants?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's
most of the time I would say it's merchants. I would say also with camera registries, other examples that we've been hearing come up more often is Ring doorbells. Folks have been using those if you've had a package stolen, things like that. But Amazon is actively partnering with police departments to share that information. And some police officers will even go into neighborhoods and say, hey, we'll buy you a camera if you share your video feed with us.
Just to circle back a little bit to the question about the body-worn camera, I just want to mention one thing, saying that when it comes to surreptitious use of cameras to record people, there's the only stuff I saw on the guidelines about surreptitious use surrounding recording was about police officers recording other police officers. Basically, there's no really protection about citizen or just individual or non-police department officers. There's a lot of basically they're allowed to turn it on or turn it off at their discretion, essentially, to answer. Yeah. So and they then can store that video for a unknown amount of time. It's probably somewhere in the policy, but I couldn't find it.
Well, I see a big issue with them being allowed to turn it off and on at will because many times they don't capture any police brutality or excessive force, and it's leads to selective editing. I know there's been a push to have like uniform policies requiring anytime there's going to be, you know, like anything that might require the use of force to immediately activate the camera, just to have a record. And that protects honest officers, you know, from false accusations of excessive force as well.
Yeah, I mean, even, yes, there could be some of that in there as well. I'll need to double check. I can pull it up as we're talking.
Great. So keep your questions coming. I saw that Jim wrote wanting to know about the surveillance technology ordinances. So that is a great segue to start talking about those and give you some more information. So we've been working with advocates and residents, privacy advocates and residents in multiple areas to pass these ordinances. We've passed several all throughout the Bay, throughout Northern California, and we even passed one through the BART system. We're also in the process of trying to pass ordinances in Santa Cruz, Alameda County, or sorry, the city of Alameda and in Vallejo. So what the ordinance or these surveillance ordinances really do is create oversight, transparency, and accountability mechanisms for all surveillance technologies in the city. There's four main principles that fall within the ordinance. The first is just adequate public debate over surveillance. This is often rare if it happens at all, and in most cases it happens very late in the process, like after they've already bought the tech and used it. So that's why the first tenet of the ordinance requires public notice and meaningful debate before they seek funding or otherwise like moving forward with the surveillance proposal. The second part is a cost-benefit analysis. And the cost-benefit analysis should include a fiscal analysis as well as the impacts on civil rights to the community. We need to be asking questions like, what kind of training and maintenance costs are there? What would data storage look like and how long is the data kept for? And then we also need to ask, what are the costs to our rights and our freedoms and the trust of the community? Does this really solve our problems or is it just creating new ones, right? When we know that surveillance disproportionately affects Black and brown people, it also disproportionately affects immigrants and people who are houseless. You know, is that something that we want to move forward with, knowing that those risks exist? So we found a publicly available use policy for fewer than 1 in 5 surveillance technology programs in California. Jason mentioned before, even with the ALPR policy, they kept referencing this other policy, which was nowhere to be seen or found. And so we think a legally enforceable use policy builds in safeguards to ensure that if moving forward, surveillance is used in a limited way that takes into account everything that the community wants and protects civil liberties and personal information. So right, at the very least, it should include things like, why do you want to use it, right? What is the purpose? How will it be used? What is data? How is data stored and for how long? If and how other city or non-city entities can use or access that information. So for example, we know that oftentimes, like Jason mentioned, ALPR data, it's created through a third party. The cameras and the software is created through a third party corporation. This is called Vigilant Solutions. And ACLU uncovered that Vigilant Solutions has been sharing information gathered from police departments with immigration and customs enforcement. So that again is just another layer of things we need to be thinking about. And then also know how people will be trained on the tech. We also believe that the use policy should be approved by elected officials. And the fourth part is just ongoing oversight and accountability. Oversight of surveillance technology deployment is virtually non-existent. So to ensure that surveillance technologies are being used properly and safely, the ordinance requires an annual surveillance report, fiscal and civil liberties reviews, and an evaluation on effectiveness. This part really just answers the question, did you use it the way you said you wanted to use it? And if not, there needs to be accountability about it, about what happened. Based on conversations we've had with residents, we also want to include a facial recognition ban on all technology in the city, right? We noticed that was something that was missing from all of the different policies. And we want to go ahead and, even though as far as we know, it's not being used right now, it's something that's growing, and I think it's really important for us to be proactive about it in our communities. So yeah, this would just, as I mentioned, ban facial recognition technology, the cameras, as well as information obtained from facial recognition tech and the software. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Omar to talk a little bit more about this process.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So I guess the first question is, who has the power? And we, the people, have the power. And so that's why I'm going to tell you how to pass a municipal ordinance to help something like this happen, to allow accountability for law enforcement use of law enforcement surveillance technologies. Why do we call them law enforcement surveillance technologies? Because these are not widely available technologies. They're only available to law enforcement. So start off with a municipal ordinance is a local law passed by a municipality, which is a city or a county. Can you all hear me well? Yeah, okay, good. The city council, we're going to talk about city councils generally. A municipality can be, city like Sebastopol, Petaluma, the city of Sonoma, Healdsburg, Cloverdale, or it could be the county of Sonoma. But we're going to talk about cities because there's a bunch of cities that, we could probably start with. So the city council has the power to pass municipal ordinances to regulate conduct within city limits. And the members of the city council are elected officials, and they're elected by the registered voters within city limits. So when city council members are getting messages, they're particularly sensitive to messages from their constituents because they are, of course, looking for election, re-election, and they want to make sure that they're responsive to their to the people who elected them. And now the police chiefs at the city level make or implement the policy, but they don't really have constitutional authority. There's a lot of control of police chiefs that the city councils have. And then the city council has influence over the police department, and they can absolutely help shape policy and implementation. They can hire and fire the police chief. They can also hire and fire the city manager, who usually has day-to-day oversight over the police chief. So let's keep in mind that the police is like a paramilitary organization where the police chief is the very top of the hierarchy, and then lower down there are like the captains, and then the lieutenants, all the way down to the regular officers or deputies. And so they don't control everything. It's the city council. We have civilian control of the police, and that's something that's super important to remember. So now we're going to talk about a resolution versus an ordinance and why a ordinance may be more desirable. A resolution is usually a symbolic declaration about future purposes or proceedings. of the city council, or it's a policy statement. An ordinance is a local law that's adopted with all the legal formality of a statute. And there's usually a notice period, and then there has to be 2 public hearings before an ordinance can be adopted. The public hearings, the meetings of the city council are held regularly, usually every other week. And it's important to check the agendas for me, which you can find online. You just put in, the name of the city, for example, Sebastopol City Agendas, and you put that into your search engine, and it will pop up an internet site of the city with all of the future meetings and all the agendas. And you can check this the week before. Usually it's like a few days before the meeting, and then you can look at the agenda, and then that gives you super important information for your advocacy. So an example of a resolution is let's go to the next slide or next thing. Thank you. An example of a resolution is Sebastopol Resolution number 6224. And that's just amending a salary schedule for police dispatchers. They don't need to pass a whole ordinance in order to amend the salary for police dispatchers. They just pass that by way of a resolution. But an example of an ordinance is the Sebastopol Municipal Code section, which prohibits discharge of firearms within city limits, except for a few exceptions. And so generally you want an ordinance for these kind of oversight measures. So it's not just a non-binding resolution, but it's actually like has teeth and it has an enforcement mechanism to it. Now, in order to pass an ordinance, next slide, please. The first step is to identify the decision makers. Is it the city council members? Is there a city manager or as chief executive officer? What about staff members? Because they're all really important. Especially staff usually makes a recommendation that the city council will follow. So identifying all of the decision makers will help you craft, and audience is more likely to be successful. Step 2 is, how do you get on the agenda? Well, there's different ways. Certainly, probably the easiest way is to work with the ACLU of Northern California to send an introductory email or letter to a supportive member of the city council and get them to introduce the item on the agenda. Another way to get items on the agenda is every time a city council or board of supervisors meeting opens, they always ask for comments for items that are not on the agenda. And so that's a good time to introduce items to put on future agendas. You could say, this is not on today's agenda, but we want you to take it up in the future. Step 3, mobilize the community to show up at the next meeting of that governing body. And that is super important because in a representative democracy, the representatives will listen to the people who show up. And as Woody Allen joked, 9/10 of life is showing up, but especially in politics, it's the only way to be effective. If people don't show up in support of this initiative of a law enforcement surveillance technology ordinance, it's not going to be successful because the elected officials think there's no public support. And so having a lot of people show up by Zoom these days, like you don't really need to like step out of your house. You can show up by Zoom wearing your PJs and really make a huge difference and get these local laws, ordinances passed. And then step 4 is public comment. So in order to speak, you have to make a comment, and now we'll get into how to craft your public comment. A tip that I have is, prepare to speak on multiple agenda items. So if you're gonna go speak about your law enforcement surveillance technology ordinance, and as you're like looking at the agenda, to make sure when it's gonna be on, because usually there's gonna be like, the agenda's gonna tell you like the first items, there's items not on the agenda. The next item is items on the consent calendar, and any awards or any cool stuff like that. And then the next thing is gonna be a whole bunch of agenda items which are open for public comment. And so if you see something there that that resonates with you, that you want to speak about, that's the best time. That has nothing to do with law enforcement technology, surveillance technology ordinance. For example, like, we're going to take a hypothetical example. There's like, like they want to open up like some sidewalks to outdoor dining because these restaurants are struggling. And so these are usually taken up by the, the city council, and that's on the agenda. And you feel strongly about that either way, and you can make intelligent, informed arguments about that. It's good to speak about that and use that time to introduce yourself, to say, I live here, I work here, I go to school here. And really, that way you can use that time to build a connection with the decision makers, and you're not using up your airtime to talk about the law enforcement surveillance technology ordinance. And so that's super important, is to try to connect with the decision makers. And many times these decision makers, they're going to be taking sides on these hotly contested topics. So you can use that as an opportunity to speak at the right time, back them up, and then get their support from the city council members later on. Let's see now, public comment. So this first step is research. And the first research you do is you look at what's on the agenda and what the priorities are. Another type of research is to create what I call like a dossier, which is basically like a file folder that has all available information about a particular decision maker, and then create dossiers on all the decision makers, dossiers that have all the information about every single city council person, every single decision maker, the relevant staff people, because that will help you tailor your message in a way that is persuasive to those decision makers. And so you don't know what your research is going to turn up. Maybe it turns out that one of the city council members has the same interest in dogs that you do, or another city council member, loves pizza as much as you do, or plays softball the same way that you do. These are all things that can be super helpful in, creating a message that is tailored for your audience. The next step is preparing what you want to say, and it's a good idea to write it down so that there's plenty of time for you to get through what you want to speak about. Write bullet points and stick to those. I usually tell people don't go without any notes, because sometimes you can freeze up. Bullet points are good. The next step is to attend the city council meeting, which is usually by Zoom these days, and then identify the agenda items that you're going to be speaking about. And then the final step is to speak. And you should be, by now, like with all the preparation, it shouldn't be hard for you to speak. And if it is, like, everybody is afraid of public speaking. The number one fear that people have is public speaking. So remember, everybody feels that way. And the best way to get rid of the fear is to acknowledge it and to use it to give you bravery. Use that to speak more. And so the best way to dissipate the fear of public speaking is to start speaking. And so if you have any questions on that, I'd be happy to coach anybody who's going to speak at a city council meeting and advocate for one of these ordinances. I've been a lawyer for many years and studied trial advocacy and public speaking, and I'd be happy to coach anybody who wants some tips on that. Thank you so much. And then, Raquel, do you want to talk about looking ahead?
Yep. Thanks so much. Yeah, and great. Thank you so much for posting information in the chat. I hope folks check out the information that Josh posted. So what can we do next? We are, if Omar or Jason, one of you could post the petition in the chat. Thank you. We want to ask city council members to pass a surveillance, transparency, and accountability ordinances. So what we're hoping to do is have folks sign this petition, and then we'll work with you to get the signatures of everybody who signed it in your city, and you'll be able to present it to your city council members. We also encourage you to connect with the ACLU of Sonoma County Chapter and attend the next meeting. The Omar and Jason we connected through a subcommittee of folks who are interested in law enforcement surveillance technology oversight. And you can reach out to the chapter chair, Patricia. And then also, please reach out to me if you have any additional questions about surveillance, about tech, about anything that came up. And we would love, and also if you're interested in trying to pass an ordinance in your city. So with that, we'll just spend the rest of the time answering some questions. I answered some of the questions in the chat, but I did want to raise up some of them because they were really good. Someone had asked about, can city council override a policy of the police department? And the answer I have is it depends, right? So in most cases, well, in all cases, city council holds the purse strings of the police department. So they technically can ask for a use policy. If they don't like a use policy or one doesn't exist, they can refuse to provide funding. And for me, like, that seems like an override of the policy. And there are some cases I mentioned. So the ordinance would also like put that process as the standard. I will say stingrays, or they're known as cellular site simulators. They act like cell towers, and they force cell phones to connect to it. That's how they work. They're particularly egregious, and so there's actually a state law saying that any police department who has a stingray has to have a policy that's presented, approved, and discussed by the public through city council. So that's another specific piece of technology that could potentially be vetoed or overridden by city council. But in most cases, no. In most cases, it's just entirely up to the police chief. To the police chief and the police department. And so that's why all of this is unknown to a lot of us. That's why this has really been done in secret, or we say it's been done in secret.
There was one question I wanted to address real quick about 5G. So 5G wireless are just cell phone towers that are placed more often because to get better signal. And so that technology in of itself won't actually, is not a surveillance risk. I think the question itself speaks more broadly to how do police departments use cellular, like cell phones and cell phone records. So Raquel mentioned things like stingrays, where they can see what numbers pass by certain locations. If there's evidence for, if they want to know, for example, who was in the area of a crime scene around this particular cell phone tower, they can request basically a dump of all the calls that went in and out of that cell phone tower within a period of time. And there is technology around, for example, that you then trove and mine through that information in order to figure out who called whom and who could be potential suspects. But again, all of this is really independent of 5G. 5G is just another way of cell phones to make those calls. It is the relationship between the cellular provider and the police departments that leads to the kind of surveillance that we're talking about. That's not inherent in any kind of wireless communication.
I would add that it seems that 5G does provide more accurate location tracking. And so with the aggregation of data that is happening using technology such as CellHawk, where law enforcement are getting these huge data dumps from cell phone towers, that they may be able to reconstruct more accurate locations. But I don't think 5G in and of itself presents a surveillance threat. It just allows more accurate location tracking.
Yeah, and just to the accuracy point, I mean, cell phones are already pretty accurate, right? It's like you're talking about the difference between 30 feet and 5 feet or something like that, or like 60 feet and like 20 feet. And it's not, yeah, it's more accurate, but it's nothing that's, the genie's already out of the bottle. We already have, they can already be tracked using cell phones and your cell phone. It's nothing that 5G won't really make that any worse, I guess is my point.
Yeah. I mean, for me, from a Fourth Amendment perspective, because this technology is not available to the public, then a warrant needs to be used every time it's employed. And those warrantless, use of this technology, just routine surveillance, is unacceptable and violates the Fourth Amendment because it's not something that people have available.
Right, thank you. Are there any other questions in the last 2 minutes?
Question.
Sure, Paul.
You haven't talked about funding. I mean, the Electronic Frontier Foundation had an article last year about how these law enforcement agencies get the money to buy the equipment. And there's a variety of sources, some of it's just asset forfeiture. They go through federal grants. Private benefactors was another one. It was interesting because somebody with some money gives money to an intermediary that then funds this stuff, and nobody else really knows about it. And there are kickbacks apparently between police departments. So some department gets the equipment and then champions it, and nearby police departments buy the same thing and they get a kickback to the first one. The whole system is corrupt. So you said nothing about it. It's not, doesn't detract from anything you said. It's a larger piece of the puzzle. And I would just comment that we all probably thinking the same thing as Naomi Klein's shock doctrine is in effect now. That's when the right wing uses some crisis as an excuse to expand the government surveillance and abuse. And so we're going to see this happen with the insurrection and finding all these folks out there, and they're going to be championing the use of all this technology and tell us how wonderful it is in an effort to try to disarm people like us who think it ought to be limited. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Paul. And yeah, I will add, if folks want to know more specifically about where these federal grants are coming from for local law enforcement, in the Bay Area, the initiative is called Urban Areas Security Initiative, UASI. That's the Bay Area one, but I know that they help funnel the money and provide these federal grants really throughout all of Northern California. And even I've been hearing from the SoCal affiliate, people also from LA also trying to apply for it. So if you're wanting to know more about it, the Urban Areas Security Initiative is something you can definitely find some articles about. So thank you again, everybody, so much. I appreciate you joining, and as I mentioned, we'll send the recording out. We will send the slides out to everybody, as well as the petition. Please share the petition with those who you think would be interested, and we'll keep in touch on ways to get involved in all the different areas folks want to pass the ordinance, and we'll work together to make sure that it happens this year. And yes, please attend the next chapter board meeting, as well as if you're in, I think it was Petaluma, the workshop on race relations and policing policy tonight. And see if you can ask some questions, because I think that would be a really good opportunity. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.